talking back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only podcast that takes place right here between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Brendan.
And I'm Jake.
And this week is another What We Talk About episode focusing on a new thematic lens. So these episodes have been a longtime fan favorite. They're some of our most engaged with episodes. And Jake and I are really excited, I think, to tackle this one especially. But if you're new to the show, and it turns out there's a lot of people who are new to the show as of lately, welcome. We're so excited that you're here. We broke into the top 100 games podcasts in Denmark on Apple, and the top 150 in the United States on Apple. So that's like a pretty cool milestone for the show. But we wanted to be sure you know what these What We Talk About episodes are and what their goals are generally. So it's like we're trying to create a new lens to look at a decision space and also explain what we talk about when we're talking about a different subject. So this time, theme. How'd I do, Jake?
I think you did great. Yeah, it's very much a consider the lobster type approach where we start with one subject and then just scoop up everything around it. So this week is theme. We kind of intersperse these more serious topics with the more fun ones, I guess, like when we did previously our top 10. So this is going to be a nitty gritty deep dive into theme and what that means in board games, into decision space. So, I mean, if that doesn't excite you, I don't know what will.
And I think that you should be excited because you will leave today, hopefully, with a new way to look at theme in games, which is something Jake and I always try to accomplish with these episodes and to greater or lesser extents. And I think this week, at least for me, my perspective on theme has really changed. So getting to share that with you all will be awesome. But before we get into that, we do have a review. This one is a review from a user named K9 in the Discord. He joined the Discord recently after discovering the show and I think listening to our Castles of Burgundy episode first and then Emotep, and had lots of great things to say. But here's his most recent review. Brendan recommended I listen to the Signposts episode, and I was not disappointed. The best thing I learned was that I should use the idea of signposts to show new players what to look for and think about. It's a new way for me to think about games and how to teach them. Thanks for that.
Thank you so much, K9, for those kind words. And yeah, as long as people keep leaving reviews wherever we can find them, you know, if it's in our Discord, if it's a review in Apple Podcast, or anywhere else, Reddit, you know, if we can find them, we'll definitely include them in the show. You know, it keeps us going and makes us so happy to see that.
For all you pre-planners out there, all the players who like to play along so you can have experienced the games we discuss, as a reminder, coming up, we have Praga Caput Regni, the Vladimir Suchy game about Prague and the building of Prague. It's a big Euro-style game with interesting juxtaposition of choices and bonuses like we'd expect from Vladimir Suchy, the designer of Underwater Cities, and a bunch of other games. So that's coming up next week. Then after that, we're going to visit a game in the Board Game Geek top, not 100, not 50, but I believe as of right now, top 15, and that is Spirit Island. That one's available. Prague is available on Yucata to play for free, and there's a Spirit Island app. Costs $20 though. But you can like play half of a game without.
Yeah, you can get a little sampler and learn the rules anyway, if you want to do that, and it'd be free that way.
Okay, so let's get into the meat of our discussion today, and that is taking a look at themes. So I wanted to start with a quick anecdote, which is a sort of how this whole discussion kicked off, which was essentially this. Many times in my life, I have walked into a board game store, been at a board game convention, been talking about theme with someone, and it has come up where they've been like, what's a thematic game that you really enjoy, Brendan? And I've said something like, I really like Reiner Knizia's Modern Art. I think it's a really thematic game. And in concert, everyone around me goes, you dumbass. That is not a thematic game at all. What are you talking about? There's no thematic mechanisms. There's barely a narrative to this game. It's just like a vague term. Tigris and Euphrates isn't a thematic game. It's an abstract game. What are you talking about? And I think that sort of difference between how I feel about some of Reiner Knizia's games and why I think they're generally fairly thematic in a way that maybe some games aren't, led to this conversation of why does it feel that way to me? And why does it not feel that way to other people?
That anecdote is so insightful, and it gets to really the crux of this conversation we're having today, which is there are different ways to think about theme, different ways themes can be conveyed through games. Uh, and, clearly through that discrepancy, that's a perfect example of, the kind of terminology that is just thrown around in board games
Mm.
that don't really have a clear definition. And I think theme is perhaps one that there's no bigger.
I completely agree, Jake. And I think the best way that we could start off this week's pursuit of creating this lens and sharing it with everyone is really just defining theme then, so we can all be on the same page. And you have laid out what I think is a beautiful encapsulation of theme generally. So you should share it so I don't pilfer your great idea.
My definition of theme is quite simply the subject of the game. What is the game about?
Yeah, and I think that that's really, really important. And there's so many, what we're going to get into is the different ways that games accomplish delivering on that subject, right? So if the theme generally is the subject of the game, there's so many different mechanisms that a game can use and different types of theme that can contribute to fully realizing that theme. I think it's also important that we talk about why themes exist. And I think largely themes exist because they help us as players become immersed in the game and within the experience. They give us a language to understand some of the mechanisms going on. They give us an environment maybe to help us get our headspace, bring all of the cultural baggage that we have to a game based on past experiences with pieces of art that share a similar theme, right? When I come to a game about space exploration, I'm bringing a whole life of engaging with things about space exploration that are uh, sort of these built-in biases that designers can utilize as shorthand on ideas that are going to make it easier for me and everyone I'm playing with to be immersed in that environment and create a strong magic circle.
Absolutely. I think, and this is not to disparage theme at all, but in so many ways it can be a shortcut. It can be a shortcut into learning the game, into understanding the game, a shortcut into, yeah, right, like you're saying, engaging with that material so that not every single time a designer sits down to make a game or we as players sit down to play a game, we're starting from square one of like inventing, a whole new universe of ideas.
Which is so important too, because as Jeff Engelstein says, the original sin of board games is having to learn the rules. So anything the designer can do to help make that easier is a huge win, because then the quicker we are experiencing the game itself, which is a huge aspect of it. I think also this will probably be the last time that we touch on games that don't have themes in this episode, but I thought now might be an important opportunity to just like put it in the air that there's of course other ways that players can become immersed in a game than a game's theme. We're not trying to equate just those two things. So there's really awesome abstract games that aren't just sort of classic abstracts like Go or chess, but like Set, the classic card game from the 1980s, or No Thanks, that really don't have a theme so much as are trying to capture an emotional idea, or in the case of Set, just really trying to create immersion through bringing everyone into this hyper focused gameplay state that you're sharing that has nothing to do with an environment or fully realizing that subject.
I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I'm not sure I would agree that those games don't have themes, right? Like, I think you could say, I think this is going to segue very nicely into the first type of theme we're going to talk about now, environmental theme. And so I could think you could say, the game of Set has very, very low or no environmental theme, but it still like has a subject, right? The game is still about collecting sets.
To your point too, I think No Thanks is a game where the name is giving us a feeling, excuse me, that it is wanting you to, it's preparing you just with that little tiny bit, the title, preparing you for the feeling that you might feel while playing this game and the headspace that the game wants you to be in. So even in the slightest way, I
Yeah.
think, yes, there is a few droplets in the parts per million of theme there.
And I think let's table that here. And I think at the end of the episode, when we're kind of going through our categorization of themes, that might give us the opportunity to bring this up a little bit more in and around some other examples of where themes may or may not exist.
Awesome. That sounds great. So, as we get into it, there's really going to be these three major buckets that Jake and I have identified that help sort of convey the subject, convey the theme of a game that all bring games different types of feel in terms of their theming. So as Jake alluded to, the first type that we have is really the environmental theme. This is the narrative of the game, right? It's what's this game about? It's the extent to which the game subject is portrayed through all of its presentation, its art, its title, its flavor text, its production, everything around the aesthetics of the game and the game's narrative that tells you what the subject in nuance is, right? Because the subject can be a lot of things. So the environmental theme is a more focused take on how it relates to that subject.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And uh, not at all to disparage environmental theme because it's incredibly important to the way we experience a game. But I think another way you could think about this is it's all the thematic elements of the game, everything that points to the subject of the game that doesn't actually impact the rules of the game in any way.
And I think that that's something that's really unique to games. And a lot of times when people talk about theme, we're so used to discussing theme in other types of art, whether it's books or movies or comics, that I think people's brains, because we're practiced with this language, default a lot of the times to thinking of theme in its most basic way as the environmental theme of a game. But the cool thing about games is that they go beyond that and they have ways to convey their theme beyond just the environmental theme. So I think partially the conversation of like, no, I think we'll go back to that anecdote a lot of the Reiner Knizia, is people getting caught up in saying, what are you talking about? Like, there's not very much theme here. The game's just called Tigris and Euphrates, and then everything else is abstract, and the board's pretty simple, and there's not a lot of flavor in this game. And I think that's a hangup.
Wherever you're hearing theme, I think mostly people are thinking about this category. I think environmental theme is kind of the predominant way in which people are thinking about theme right now. I think that some of these other two categories are certainly being intuited by people. When they say a game is highly thematic, they might be intuiting some of these other things we're about to discuss now. But I think in general, when people say, okay, I like that game's theme or I don't like that game's theme, they're thinking about these components, like what the game's about, what's the art, and like what is the subject of the game.
Totally. And it's so hard to know what a game's theme really is without playing it too, because all games have a perspective, even if they don't set out to. And without playing the game, you don't fully understand the theme. You can't just understand a theme from its environmental theming, though to lesser and greater extents, games might portray theme through these next two buckets that Jake and I are going to talk about. And we're going to talk about examples of all of these games a little bit later on the show and dive deeper on each of these buckets. But in introducing them, the next two buckets are both gameplay related theming. So these are two ways in which games convey theme through their gameplay. And the first of which is mechanical. So if environmental is the narrative of a game, this is the metaphor, right? It's all the things within the gameplay that are symbolic stand-ins for what is happening with the subject in terms of action, right? So the extent to which the game simulates the subject. So a lot of times you might think of that in terms of a lot of Euro games have high mechanical theming, right? My brain first a lot of the times goes to like farming games where what you're doing, so much of the mechanics are stand-ins for creating and producing things. Underwater Cities is another game that we've talked about where this is a pretty mechanically themed game. You're building tunnels, you're producing things that are giving you an input for your civilization to continue to build more.
Agricola is a great classic example of this, right? What are the actions in this game? It's like, okay, you're baking bread, you're building fences, you're, adding, breeding animals, right? All literal things that simulate the subject of the game, which is building a farm.
And I think that highlights on the point that mechanical theming, when it's done right or when it's done really effectively, is usually about, is what I would imagine I would be doing in this theme mechanically aligning with what I can mechanically do in the game, right? So if it's a farming game, and it's presented as that's the subject, and I'm, within the game, there's a mechanic where I can play video games, maybe that works really well, but it would feel discordant that within the subject of that game, my expectations of that being an available action as a player, that feels off in terms of the presentation, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I think too, this gets a lot as like intellectually, it makes sense. Like I'm able to connect the rules of the game to that subject through what I'm doing. Not that, you know, of course, there's always going to be shortcuts in every single game, right? Nothing can be a perfect simulation, but it's that like effort to simulate things as opposed to not.
I think another way to think about this one too is like if you're playing a space exploration game, to use another example, and you're going to upgrade the engines on your ship, you would expect those engines to like increase the speed at which you can travel or the maneuverability of your ship, but you wouldn't expect enhancing your engines to increase your combat or to increase your ship's defenses, right? So, and a lot of games like understand mechanical theming enough to not make that mistake, but that would be really bad mechanical theming if increasing your engines made your attack better.
Right. Perfect. So we move on to our third category of theme, and this also falls under that bucket of gameplay theming. And this is decisional theme or decision space theme. And that's the extent to which players feel like they are enacting the subject of the game while playing. And I think of all of what we're discussing today, this might be the one that is like a little bit more controversial. So I think we want to spend a little bit of time to make sure we're clear in what we're talking about here.
Yeah, definitely. And this is probably maybe the freshest perspective. So really this is a subset. All of these types of theming contribute to one another. I think that's another really important thing for us, Jake and I, to just say off the bat. But the presence of some of them is going to impact how the others feel. And in terms of decisional feeling, right? How does the actual choices and decisions that you get to make in the game make you feel like that premise is being delivered? So to go back to the Reiner Knizia example, even if the theme is pretty low in a game like High Society, where the most pivotal rule is if you spend the most money, you can't win the game, even if you've collected the most points. That to me feels like very strong decisional theming because I feel the tension of being in this community of players where we're all trying to chase getting the most points, or sort of the mechanics don't line up perfectly, but like purchasing these really extravagant things to like ball out and look like we're the wealthiest member of society, but you've actually spent your most money, then you're not winning. So you feel that tension of wanting to overstep what you're actually capable of doing to appear greater than you are, but knowing that in the long run, to be the best member of the high society, you have to have the most points and you can't have the least amount of money.
We'll discuss this more in just a second about what kind of makes decisional theme stronger or weaker. But to put a point on it here, I think we've defined decision space itself before. A brief definition of it would just be the experience of choice in a game. So this is, to what extent that experience, that subjective experience of choosing what to do in a game feels thematic. It feels like you are, in making those choices, enacting that subject, right? If it's Agricola, right, we talked about how the rules do intellectually connect with the subject. It's simulating it that in that way. This would be one step further. Do I feel like I'm farming? Do I feel like I'm managing a farm?
And feel is the big word with decisional theming. That's if you're going to take away one thing, take that away. Does the game feel like what I imagine it might feel like to be enacting its subject, right? And some games that won't even make sense, right? Games that don't have a lot of decisional theming, you'll be like, what are you talking about? There's no decisional theming in this game. But another example, when Jake and I were talking about this, right, is like you could imagine a submarine game where the mechanical theming of that game is really great. You can fire torpedoes, you can look at your radar, you can do all of these different things. But if all of the other systems within the game don't align to actually make you feel like you're being the captain of a submarine, then that game doesn't have great decisional theming. And there's different way for all of those mechanisms to come together to create that, whether it's the way the scoring happens or the turn structure or the way that you're interacting with other players, that create this sort of decisional experience of the decision space overall that makes you feel like you're making the choices that you might make in real life versus making the choices that are right in the game.
Yeah, and I think Submarine is actually like a really great example because, well, I'm not very versed in wargaming, right? There are war games about operating submarines that are like super technical, like super simulation based, and go much further to simulate that experience and have much stronger like mechanical theming than a game like Captain Sonar. But Captain Sonar, if you've played it, is like a quintessential example to me of strong decisional theming, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's like you're communicating with a crew, you have a specific role, you're interacting with your opponents, things are happening in real time, like you have to act quickly, and all those elements together create this really strong sense that I am the first mate and like my captain is an idiot.
Yeah, totally. No, exactly. And the stress of that real-time nature of that game and being in that actually environment and how that feels, definitely. And I think as we continue this conversation and start to discuss maybe what makes mechanical theming or what makes decisional theming effective, I think we'll skip that part of the conversation for environmental theming because that's just like a conversation of aesthetics and like what makes art effective. And well, that's a really interesting and important conversation. I don't know that our podcast is the best podcast to dig into it. But I think as we cap this off, the two other points are really within these contexts, all these three categories, as Jake said, of environmental theming, decisional theming, and mechanical theming. Theme is a spectrum. You can have a ton of one of these and a little bit of two of the others, or a ton of all of them. And also, all theme serves that subject, right? So no theme is successful if not for its relationship with how it informs your experience of the subject itself. You can't look at theme in a vacuum. It always relates to that core idea of what is this game about.
So should we jump into a discussion of what determines how effective mechanical theming is first?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so we've tried to come up with a list of some ideas for what we think serve to highlight or make mechanical theme strong in a game. So, sort of the first one is: are my expectations of the experience of the subject delivered on by the core actions available to the player? So this is the mechanical premise delivery.
Totally. And this is what we talked about a little bit before of like in a farming game, am I mechanically doing the things that I would expect to do in a farming game? Do I have available actions that feel right given the subject of the game? Or this is also like we were talking about with the spaceship engines of like when I get a sword, to give a different example, is that sword making me more effective at offense? Or is it, in this game, maybe you can imagine a game where like you get a sword and instead you become much better at becoming an eloquent speaker. That's going to be a really weird mechanical theming where it doesn't even sort of make sense. And there's a breakdown between your expectations of that mechanical premise and what you can do happens. And I think that one of the best examples of strong mechanical theming in a game, or like a core baseline example that I always go back to when thinking about mechanical theming, is flying in Magic the Gathering. I think this is one of the mechanics that's the most clear when you're teaching someone Magic the Gathering. If you've taught them the core rules of combat, sort of, and then you say to them, okay, there's flying. What does flying do? And you think, okay, well, you go over all the things without flying. They can't interact with it because you're up in the air.
To your point about all themes being kind of connected to the subject of the game, I think a lot of times like mechanical themes can be really clever and serve to reinforce the environmental theme of the game in a really strong way. One example we've talked about before on this podcast that really like it's just like a small little touch. It affects the rules of the game, but it really just like elevates everything. Is the magnifying glass and journal in Arnak, where you can't ever move your journal ahead of the magnifying glass up the research track, and that's like reinforcing this idea that as archaeologists, you have to like first look at an object before you can record it in your journal. And it's just a cute little touch that makes total sense with the subject of the game that kind of highlights, it makes intuitive intellectual sense.
I'm so glad you shared that too, because that's a mechanic where if it was like you can't move your red marker up further than your blue marker, all of a sudden there's this extra rules baggage that's hard to remember. But once that idea clicks, like, oh, I have to look at stuff before I write it down, all of a sudden it's just so intuitive. And that's what strong mechanical theming done well does for a game, is it makes you intuitively understand how the rules should vaguely be working as a shorthand to get to play the game faster.
Definitely.
Okay, cool. So let's do a similar thing for our decisional theming, which I think we might delve a little bit deeper. And I think in determining how does effective decisional theming happen in a game and what does it look like? And I think for me, the biggest thing in terms of thinking about strong decisional theming in a game, how much does the game feel like what I would expect it to feel like or want it to feel like, is how effectively do the gameplay incentives lead to behavior that feels thematic to the subject, right? So is the game enabling me to do the things that feel like what they should be doing, right? So I don't know, in say like the Resistance, as a spy, I'm incentivized to deceive the other players, because if I can convince someone else that a different person who I know is not a member of the Resistance is a member of the Resistance, then I will be suspected less. So the mechanics of that game and the magic circle that it creates and everything is incentivizing me to act like a spy who has actually infiltrated a Resistance, because if I was just passionately truthful, it would be horrible, right? I couldn't even play the game. And then the flip side is, as a Resistance member, Jake, like it doesn't behoove you to lie. You just have to do your best at telling the truth.
Right. Yeah. I think that's such a perfect example of this, because that's such a simple, a simple idea in the game, but to play the game well in the Resistance, it forces you to get into the role of the agent within the game.
Yeah.
And when you're making the decisions, right, who to trust, is this person my friend? Is this person, secretly spying on me? It's like, that is it. That is exactly the experience of the subject of the game.
It should be no surprise that both Jake and I think that the Resistance is a game with high decisional theming. You really feel like it. Another way to think about this is, despite there being verbs in the game, right? Like what you can do mechanically, the actions of the mechanics, how those mechanics are implemented actually feel like what you're doing. So to use another example of Arnak, in Arnak, you explore in that game. You find new locations on the board. But when I'm finding new locations on the board, or discovering them, I don't really feel like I'm discovering new locations or making discoveries. I just feel like I'm flipping over a tile. So the mechanical theming is pretty good. I'm discovering something new, literally, but it doesn't actually feel like I'm discovering anything or even exploring the setting of that game, which is a jungle on Arnak. So that's an example of sort of low decisional theming. It just doesn't quite feel right.
It's one of the things too, where I think with mechanical theming and environmental theming, through like, it's pretty, it can be designed to, right? Like you can spend a lot of time and effort, like getting the right art, writing a great narrative, to where most people would say like, yeah, that's like a strong environmental theme. And I think the same is true with mechanical theming, where it's like, if you do research into the subject and you make sure, all the actions are, historically appropriate with the period and, so on and so forth, like you can kind of get it. But it feels like with decisional theming, there's like less of a secret sauce, right? It just feels like it's like the combination of the parts, and sometimes there is that magic and sometimes there may not be. But I think one of the big elements that you absolutely have to consider when thinking about how effective the decisional theming is the interaction between players. Because I just think that is like such a rich moment where the subject of the game is enacted by players, right? And is a part of the decisions or not.
I have a reason why I think that is, Jake, too. And I think that a big part of that is because a lot of times when we're interacting with other players is a way in which emotion most likely comes into games and enters into the games, and it gives it a level of texture that you're not going to have when you're just interacting mechanically with systems, right? So the ability for a game to make us feel things increases so much more when the game encourages the simulation to impart B by acting a specific way in the magic circle towards someone within the game. And it's probably a way that we're not used to acting with someone else. Like the resistance, to go back to that example, I'm not used to lying to my friends. So I get to feel what that feels like when I play the resistance in a way that feels incredibly thematic and deceptive. Like the resistance makes my heart beat still to this day when I play it, right? If I'm a spy, I flip over that red card. All of a sudden my heart's palpitating and I'm feeling stressed because I'm doing something where I'm trying to gain the trust of people that I don't deserve it from. And so the way in which games, when they bring in interaction with other players, I just think all of a sudden you're, instead of painting in black and white, you're painting in color.
If you think about just the difference emotionally between making a trade with a player in a game or buying a good from a player, in the game compared to buying a good from a common supply, there's something like so much more like textured and nuanced about that interaction with a person. You had to like form an alliance with someone, right? You have to make them feel comfortable that like this trade is going to be beneficial to them as it is to you. And like, what is that if not like actually you're role playing your agent in the game in some small way? Even if it's just like a momentary little thing in what's like a much larger, dry tactical Euro game. Like the fact that you had to say like, listen, okay, yeah, I could really, yeah, oh, I don't want to get rid of this property, but it's pretty good to me. But I guess if you could give me $4 for it, it'll be good for both of us. That kind of like nuanced conversation, that interaction, engaging with the player from the perspective of yourself, like your agent in the game. That's going to bring out that uh, thematic decision so much more than the kind of the dryness of interacting with the bank.
I think totally. And I think we've all played games before where the decisional theming goes wrong in a way that is funny. So a lot of times when people will think of a really strong, a game with strong mechanical theming, has a strong subject, I'm going to go back to the spaceship theme because I think it's going to be useful once again. So we're going back to the engines. Let's say in this hypothetical game, mechanically, the systems allowed me to, I started with a base set of engines that I could upgrade throughout the game. But I also have the ability to sell my engines and still move through space. So I make the decision to just like offload my engines. My ship has no engines and I can still move. I just don't get a modifier. That might be really funny, right? Like I'm doing something as the captain of that ship. I'm like, let's offload my engines. We don't need these anymore, right? And that's a moment where I think we could all sort of, that feels familiar to a really mechanical game where like the decisional theming of like, okay, if I'm actually a captain of a ship, I'm not going to sell my engines or my sails because I need those. But if the game lets you do it and you could still win, that's an example of the decisional theming not really working with the game's incentives.
Something else that kind of gets to like when if is this working? Like, does this game have strong decisional theme or not? It has to do with the communication at the table. And this is something that it could be actually part of the mechanics of the game, right? Like controlling communication limits in some way. And I think that could actually be an effective piece of it in some ways. But also, it's just the way players are talking, right? If you're playing a game, I don't know, set in space, and you're talking about dollars and victory points, that's like a bad sign for like are people really getting that thematic decision making experience. Whereas if you're talking about you know ion cannons and I don't know, like amethyst gems or whatever, that I think that's like cluing you in that like players are adopting that role in the game. And even if it's not like a role playing game, I think games can be have strong decisional theme without having any role playing elements at all. But like when you hear people using the terminology of the game kind of like unprompted and talking about the game mechanisms in that way, it kind of clues you in that like as people are making decisions, like they are thinking in that theme.
That's an example of the decisional theming being strong too, because the objects within the game have like moved past in the players' minds them just being game pieces. They've been imbued with that like totemic power of being an ion cannon or a piece of amethyst or this prize calf that like feels special. I'll also add to this point of communication. I think this is why games like limited communication co-op games can sometimes feel like the decisional theming is really low. So I really like and enjoy the game Hanabi quite a bit, but I don't feel like I'm building a fireworks show with everyone else at the table because we're just sitting there quietly. Like there's no, right? Like that doesn't really, and we're not sitting there quietly, but I don't have agency. I don't have information about what's in my hand in a way that I might if I was doing that actual activity with someone else.
I think that's true, but counterpoint, I think, and this also maybe speaks to the fact that really to get at this decisional theming, it is the sum of all its parts. I can think of several examples where limited communication really increases the decisional theming for me. And actually, let's use that to kind of transition into our next sort of topic here, where we think through some or should I give the examples now? Would that make more sense?
Whatever works for you. Both sound good to me. We can leave them with a cliffhanger, or we could just hop right into it.
Okay, let's cliffhanger.
Okay. So I guess this next idea too is the idea that the how effectively the mechanical theme is implemented can increase a game's decisional theming, but it's of course not the only way to accomplish this. So to give an example of this idea, I find the room mechanic in Grand Austria Hotel. That's an example of a mechanic. I'm moving my patrons from our little cafe where they came for lunch into a hotel block within the hotel that actually makes me feel like I'm running a hotel because I'm putting people into rooms. I'm opening rooms up in a way within the game. You prepare rooms, right? You prepare rooms at a hotel, you have to clean them, and then you're stashing your little patrons away into them. So for me, that's an example of an aspect of the mechanics of that game that actually increase the decisional theming. I don't totally feel the aspects of like preparing food in that game increase the decisional theming really. Like I can take these cubes, but not these cubes. And it all feels pretty mechanical and dry and like a game, but not like what I think I'm doing, which is cooking food and preparing food for people. But putting people in rooms, great. I got it. I feel like I'm a hotel manager.
Maybe another example of this is like if you compare a simple train laying game like Ticket to Ride to a simple train laying game like Iberian Gauge that I recently played. Like it's no question that the decisional theme in Iberian Gauge is so much stronger, and I think the reason for that is that you become a partial owner of a train company with somebody else at the table or multiple other players. So it's not just a matter of building your own trains, right, which is totally internal. You have to work collaboratively with people. So it just that simple touch that I'm going to put one train segment down and then somebody else is going to have the next opportunity to do that. Like it forces me to collaborate with them and say like, hey, Brendan, like I'm thinking about moving here towards this city. How does that, work for you? And then you might say, that's great. And you're lying to me because you want, you want me to waste my resources and you're going somewhere else. Or maybe we are collaboratively working together. But like in that moment, like we are co-managing this train company. Where, in Ticket to Ride, it's just me. I'm just doop, doop, doop. And then I'm going to build the next one over here if I can.
It's so interesting too in the way in which like 18xx games like Iberian Gauge, which I haven't played before but I would love to, by bringing in like an economy and shared ownership, it's simulating the same. The subject is the same, more or less, trains, but it just allows you to experience a different aspect of that in a more real way, like the actual business environment of trains being built. It's so cool. And I think too, Jake, one thing that why people often say that for me, why Reiner Knizia games don't feel thematic is because I think a lot of his games have really low mechanical theming, but actually high decisional theming. So I think that in games like modern art, where you're buying and selling paintings, sure, but like my player board is a museum. So am I an art trader? Am I a museum? I'm not displaying images. And when I do, I'm selling them. Why am I a museum hawking these artists, these images? Like it doesn't make a ton of sense, but the way it relates to the core idea of like simulating the modern art feels right. Like I'm buying into these artists when they don't have a lot of reputation, and then I'm trying to boost their reputation up. And I'm excited when more people are buying their paintings because then I know they're going to be more valuable. I think so the mechanics aren't aligning, but the feel of that modern art environment for me really is. And I think another example is a game like Blue Lagoon. Blue Lagoon is a game in which you're playing as these different peoples settling onto archipelagos, like Polynesian, moving between these islands. And I think in a lot of games, when someone was going to tackle this theme, they might say, like, okay, you have to collect this much wood and you have to make sure this much water is nearby. And these are the rules for canoeing between islands. And then if you have this much wood and you have the ability to build fire, you can build a settlement. And Reiner Knizia is like, no, I'm not mechanically interested in anything like that. The mechanics of this game are that you're going to place out these little chits that represent your civilization, and you're going to move across all of these islands, and you'll collect these little resources. But for the most part, mechanically, the game is kind of like a Go variant. You're just one per turn. But when I play Blue Lagoon, I actually feel like I'm creating a society that's stretching across multiple islands. I feel like I'm collecting resources, and I'm struggling against different societies in a way that I might actually do in real life as I'm pressing up against each other and blocking each other. So I think Reiner Knizia's games have really high decisional theming, but usually pretty low mechanical theming in a way that doesn't truck with how a lot of people think about theming. And I think it's also because a lot of Reiner Knizia's theming is more metaphorical, where you're not mechanically doing what's literal, you're doing a stand-in for it, but all of the systems come together to make you feel like the idea of the game.
And I think we'll be talking about even more Reiner Knizia games yet as we move into the last part of our episode here. And I think I'm really excited about this because, we've presented this new way to talk about themes, right? It's not just theme anymore. It's environmental theme, mechanical theme, and decisional theme, or decision space theme. And so if that's true, right, that there are these different categories, there are these different ways we can categorize theme and think about it, we should be able to come up with examples that fall into different categories. So what we're going to try and do now is present to you examples of games that fall into different binary categories. So the first is environmental theme, where a game could be high environmental theme or low. Then it will be mechanical theme. And once again, right, it's a binary. It's either high or low. And then finally, decision space theme, high or low. So we're going to try and categorize games now that fall into categories ranging from high, all the way to low. Does that make sense, Brendan?
It makes complete sense. And I think as long as we interject what we mean by the first, second, and third, every once in a while, people will track with us. So I want you to lead this example because you're really excited about this one. And I think it's a perfect example for a game with high environmental theming, high mechanical theming, and high decisional theming.
Awesome. And also a game that a lot of people are going to be familiar with. And that is the beloved award-winning cooperative game Pandemic. So I just think this is a no-brainer, right? Environmental theme is a slam dunk. Like you are perfectly, situated in the game. You know exactly what it's about. You know what's going on in the world of the game. Mechanical theme makes sense, right? Like you as the CDC director are sending these agents around the board. You're working preventatively as much as possible, and you're also doing cleanup for what spills over, right? What breaks through the preventative efforts that you and your team are coming up with. And then finally, like decisional theming, I think it works here because of the way that you're engaging with this game, right? You're familiar with the map. I think that's a key point. You're familiar with the world. You understand what that might be like. So when you're making decisions throughout the game, right, you're thinking like, okay, we're going to send our agents to these real places. these people have like different expertises. I just think it's so easy to get there. And then all of that is reinforced by, the way that the game then reacts to your decisions, through the random deck of the random draw of the outbreak cards.
I think that you're completely right, Jake. And I think one thing that's interesting here, the environmental theme, the presentation of pandemic, there's a lot of imagery that matches with the board that I think gives it this feeling of like planning, of being at the helm, of directing this fight against the pandemic. I guess in pandemic, it's really four pandemics of diseases breaking out at once that sort of play into how the decisional theming actually makes you feel like you're making these decisions about trying to, okay, we really need to put some resources into directing what's happening in New York. And then to your point, the mechanical theming, the way that disease spreads by there being a density leading to a breakout, amazing mechanical theming.
It just tracks.
Even yeah, exactly. Even movement in that game, how, okay, I'm going to actually spend a card so that I'm going to take a flight, and then that lets me jump to the city rather than just moving a short amount of distance using action points. Or once we've cured a disease, the cubes of disease just fly off the board. Really good mechanical theming.
To be clear, when I'm playing this game, I don't feel like if I'm the medic, like, right, I don't feel like I'm a medic and I'm healing people.
Yeah.
But I do feel like, the kind of the role playing part, the way the decisional theme comes out as we're making decisions happens when, I'm communicating with the other players at the table. What should we do? What should we prioritize? Oh, if we go over there, then like Venezuela is going to be really bad if we draw that out of the top of the deck. It feels like we are, CDC people talking about this global strategy and how we're going to fight this. And I think it really works.
And I think you, especially as you're playing a version of Pandemic that's more difficult than your group is ready for, you feel the stress of it too, right? Like you really, when a disease breaks out, it really feels like calamity is occurring.
All right.
So go for it.
I would say just a couple other, and we won't touch on these nearly as long, but I think another example of high would be time stories. And that's actually an example where I think I did mention like where limited communication really brings you into the role of somebody who's like back in time. And I think the way the game explains it is like, well, like you're back in time, taking over these people's bodies. So like you can kind of psychically communicate with people, but it's not perfect. So when I look at a painting in that game, it's up to me to like remember the details and kind of communicate what it looks like to the other players, but I can't show them that because we're in different rooms, right? We're in different spaces. And I think it works really well there. The theme, is really engaging and engrossing. And I just think the way the time loop works, where you're playing through this scenario until you run out of time, and then you have to restart it and can work through it more efficiently, is just like a genius mechanical touch. And people, some people love the game, some people don't care for it at all. I'm kind of in the middle, but I think it really fits in this category that just does all of these things at a really high level.
To your point just there, Jake, I think that we'd be remiss not to mention, and I'm sort of sticking it into these examples, but that none of these types of theming is right. They're just different ways that games can represent theme. And I think that as we discuss this, it might be useful for you as a listener to think through why you're drawn to certain games over other games, or why other people are drawn to certain games that you aren't drawn to. And I think this lens might be really illustrative of why that is the case for games that you didn't understand previously. And there might be trends in games that you love that other people don't, and other people love and you just don't get it. And it might have to do with the way in which the theme is realized. But can we hop into high, low, Jake?
Yes. But last thing, I think, and neither of us are very experienced in 18xx games, but I think that 18xx goes in this category of high. If you're somebody that's experienced with 18xx, let us know in our Discord or on Twitter. I want to know what you think about this, but I wonder too, just as like, food for thought, like perhaps that's part of the reason why this genre games is so beloved, because it does all of these things at a really successful level.
That's really interesting. Yeah, come into our Discord, link in the show notes, and let us know your thoughts on that one. And I know we have some fans of 18x games already in our Discord who will probably jump in on that as well. The next is an example of a high environmentally themed, high mechanical themed, and a low decisional themed game. And the example that I have is the Lost Ruins of Arnak. The environmental theming is great. The mechanical theming, we kind of discussed this already, is strong. You're doing research, you're discovering these different things. The mechanical theming of some of the cards is actually pretty good also. Like there's an airplane card that lets you jump ahead of other people and how far you can explore just mechanically within the game. But I never actually feel like I'm researching anything, and I never really feel like I'm exploring anything in Arnak. So that's why the decisional theming just isn't there for me. But the rest of the theme, I think, is done really, really well.
Yeah, and I'm going to do another one of the food for thought because this is another blind spot for me. But I wonder if people talk about Vital Lacerda games as these super thematic, and highly technical mechanical games. I wonder if his games primarily go in this category too.
I
It's
do
just
own
a question.
Yeah, I've only played Vinos, and which I own and I really enjoy, and I do think that Vinos might fall into this category. I don't necessarily feel like I'm actually like growing wine and then selling it that much. It's just the way that it's implemented with all the systems don't feel that way. So I think that you could be right, and I was actually going to bring the Gallerist up. If I had played it, I'd really wonder about how, within the nature of this conversation, it relates to modern art, because I think those games might really be sort of inverse takes on the same sort of idea. But yeah.
Cool. Well, let's jump right on to the next category, which is high, low, high. So high environmental, low mechanical, but then high decisional again. So one of the examples for this for me is one of my favorite games of all time, the Arkham Horror
Mm.
LCG, which is a living card game. The environmental theme is great. There's really strong narrative. You get to read a little intro to each scenario, and then based on what actions you took, how your campaign unfolded, you'll get different endings and different conclusions. Like all that, A plus environmental theme. The mechanical theme, though, is to me, it's kind of low. It's a card game. Like you're drawing cards. Cards do different things, but like what is drawing cards? Like what am I in this game, right? I'm like moving a person around the board, but I don't, but like it's just a little bit rough, right? And then
Yeah.
you're not rolling dice, but you are drawing random tokens out of a bag, which is how you determine outcomes in almost all cases. Which it does make sense, but it's to me not super strong mechanical. Maybe somebody would disagree, but the theme, like the decisional theme of the game, comes through so strong. Like
Mm.
every time I reach my hand into the chaos bag to pull out a token, like I'm actually like so nervous. Like please don't be the skull, and that absolutely comes into the decision making process as I'm playing the
Mm.
game. Like you're thinking about that. You're scared of like what the bad results could be. Uh, you know, you do feel like in those moments you're embodying the agent in the game. So for me, I think that this is high, low, high. I think the same is true for almost all the same reasons for a game like Mansions of Madness Second Edition, where there's great environmental theme, you're exploring this mansion, but like what you're actually doing in the game when you're like exploring and doing skill checks leaves a lot to be desired, I'd say. But then again, right, it's like you're having this like fun story, and it's really easy to like get into the characters. So I think that makes sense for me, and I just think like generally these kind of like dungeon crawly games might be in this category.
I think it's really interesting that in the context of a low mechanical theming game, you brought up skill checks, because I think that might track in a lot of ways. Like the reason why people are drawn to a game like Dungeons and Dragons is not necessarily because of the mechanical theming of the game. It works as a framework to affix all of the other things that are really excited. And I know some people probably are, and that's what's exciting to them about the game. But I think for a lot of people, it's the decisional theming of Dungeons and Dragons that gets them the most excited, to actually feel like you're doing what your agents in the game are doing as you role play. So I think skill checks are usually a way to have the mechanics get out of the way and let the game and the other things that you want to shine. And that's a totally valid for games to play that way. Okay, moving on. High, low, low. So this is a really fascinating category where the environmental theming of a game is delivered incredibly strongly, whereas the mechanical theming and the decisional theming might not really be quite as strongly delivered. And Jake and I have two examples here, and one of them is actually an episode of the show that we had a very contentious BGG conversation about with people. And I think it's in part because of the theme that people are so drawn to it, and that's terraforming Mars. Jake, my feelings about the game, it's not one of my favorite games. But I do think that its environmental theming is excellent. The board is quite evocative, and the all of the naming and the flavor of the cards is really good. Mechanically, the cards don't necessarily always do what I would expect them to do. Like the pets card doesn't necessarily have that much to do with whatever pets on Mars might be, but it's cool and it has good environmental theming. Pets on Mars, that's a cool premise. And I don't generally, when I'm playing Terraforming Mars, even really feel like I'm terraforming Mars. Like as I'm adding pieces to the board, I don't really feel like I'm terraforming it. I feel like I'm just putting my forest token there because that's the right place to put the forest token, and I'm not really even thinking about other
Right, like
people
I
very
put my
much.
ocean here, and that means I get to draw a card. Like,
Yeah.
okay, great.
Yeah. But this is a game that has a ton of fans because the environmental theming works so successfully for them. And there are people where that environmental theming is enough for them. And then they enjoy the gameplay. Even if the thematic elements aren't necessarily delivered, the game is still enjoyable.
Yeah, I do think that's an interesting one, and I think people could very justifiably disagree and say that for them it is a strong mechanical theme game. And I think even in our episode we talked about how this is a simulation type game, which I think simulation is typically going to kind of be hand in hand with mechanical theming. But I do agree with you. Like for me, there's just a lot that kind of feels like very much like it's for the game.
Game
Um,
first. Yeah.
yeah. I think the most obvious example here, and it's going to be one that a lot of people know and love for the theme, as do I, and that's Wingspan. So, Wingspan has like just the most wonderful theme, in my opinion,
Yeah.
beautiful art, some of the best art, and it's just like all these great birds. There's tons of information on the birds. But like the mechanics of the game, like drawing bird cards, what is that? Like placing eggs on birds for points. Like, yes, birds do lay eggs, but like you know what I mean? Like, oh, I have to like place an egg, or I have to like take away an egg from a bird to, put it like put a different bird in play, or I have to do two eggs to put a bird in play. It's there is like enough connection there. Like it all fits in with the environmental theming, but like when you're actually playing the game itself, I don't. It does fall short of something that would be much more of like a simulation of birding or something else.
One thing that's really interesting about this example, and I completely agree, it's like for me, it came to mind first, is I think that Wingspan is some of the best environmental theming in a game I've ever seen, and that's partially why it's so successful. The eggs are gorgeous, the birdhouse is beautiful, the art's all incredible, and for this reason, I think I can convince, or not even convince, just Wingspan might be the heaviest game that I can get someone who doesn't often play games to be interested in and excited about playing. The environmental theming alone makes them want to jump into that game, but the way that the mechanical theming plays out can make that transition to actually playing the game a little bit rough if the person doesn't have a lot of experience learning the new mechanics in games.
Well, you got to run your bird engine just like in real life, where you take the one bird and that
Exactly.
does something, and then. But yeah, and I do think again, right? It's important to highlight like this is not a good or a bad thing.
Yeah.
There's no, a high game is not like inherently better in any way than a low game,
Yeah.
right? It's just a different way to categorize it, and it also doesn't mean there isn't any mechanical theming in Wingspan. Like the fact that different birds correspond to actual environments that you would find them is really nice. And, the fact that they're eating different foods relevant to what they actually eat. And, in some of the actions, like predatory birds have a certain type of action. There is nice mechanical theming in the game too. But like overall, to me, there's too many like disconnects to put it into like a high mechanical theme category.
Yeah, definitely. I think that that's really true. And the next category is an interesting one: low, high, high. So
This was
low, go for it, Jake.
I'd say, yeah, low environmental theme, but high mechanical theme and high decisional theme. To me, this was like, as I was playing through this list, this was the hardest one for me to come up with any games. So I'm really interested to hear what other people might say for this category. What I came up with was fighting game
Yeah,
simulators. So like BattleCon and Exceed, I think are good examples where you could yes, there is like a narrative of like the war of Indines in BattleCon, but it could like very easily be rethemed as anything. And point to that, like Exceed actually does have all kinds of different themes, skinned onto it, different IPs like Street Fighter, other things. So for me, like the environmental theme is pretty low. What ultimately the game is several spaces, and that's
yeah,
your whole board, and that's your movement from space to space. But the mechanical theme in BattleCon I'll use as my example here, where you're choosing to create your different like attacks by combining a base, your stance. So maybe it's and then an attack. So maybe it's like a quick kick, or I want to do the quick jab, or I want to do like the lightning kick or the lightning jab, and you're like creating these different moves is super cool and really does like bring makes sense with like a fight, that a person a fighter would have different stances, different moves, and different ways to combine them. And then I think too, thematically, like when I play this game, like do I feel like I'm having a fight, like I'm the agent like interacting in this fight? I kind of do, right? if
yeah.
i if I choose to do a step back because I know my opponent's gonna do their powerful punch and I dodge it, or I do like a big block at the right moment and it was able to like anticipate, and I'm engaging in that donkey space as we talk about, it does feel like I'm actually having that thematic fight with someone.
Yeah, because that's how fights actually happen. Totally. I completely agree with you, Jake. I think that's the best example we're gonna get, frankly. And I do think that those games fall in that category, so I'm really impressed that you pulled that out. I am gonna let you take the next one. This is low environmental, high mechanical, low decisional theming.
Yeah, right. Okay. So a game that doesn't have very much environmental theme, does have strong mechanical theme, and no decisional theme to come up. This one came to me rather quickly, and I think this might be where sports fit in. So
Mm.
if you think about disc golf, what is the theme of disc golf? I don't know. What's the mechanics of disc golf? Playing golf with discs. Home run, A plus. Here, do I feel like I'm a disc? No.
And I think, this might break down a little bit for sports, but
Another example, basketball. Hello, basketball, mechanical theme, A plus. What's the environmental theme of basketball? I don't know. But it is a game about basketball, and there you have it. It's right in the mechanics.
I think that that's a very interesting take. I will also say, if anyone can think of a board game example of a low environmental, high mechanical, low decisional, I would love to hear it. It's so
Tumbling
hard.
dice, right? I think dexterity games truly do fit here.
Jenga, as much as Jenga is an onomatopoeia, right? Like if the premise is Jenga, if Jenga is like the onomatopoeia of things falling, then like I don't know. This one's really hard.
I think tumbling dice is another home run.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This category is tough, and I think it's only natural that there's some types of arrangements of theming. Like it makes some sense that like a highly mechanical themed game with pretty low environmental theming and low decisional theming is hard to think of because they so closely relate into one another, and it's tough for the mechanics of a game to feel thematic without strong supporting in terms of what the subject is and how they would play into it.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So maybe a little bit of a stretch on that one, but yeah, if you can come up with a better example than basketball for low, high, low, please let us know. I'll be really interested to hear what people come up with. This next one I think is less of a cheat or a stretch. So low, low, high. So the only thing strong here is the decisional space. And I think this is probably the category of social deduction games, or at least those are the ones that fit in here really well. I mean, you can play the game Werewolf, right, with a deck of cards. So that's a deck of playing cards even. So that's really low environmental theme, right? It's 100% theater of the mind. The mechanics, can be a little bit of a stretch, especially if you talk about like winning or losing the game, like in a game of resistance, like you're playing best 3 out of 5. You're just like arbitrarily taking turns being the leader. Those are maybe a little bit disconnected for the way that theme would actually be enacted in real life. But as we've already discussed, like when you're actually in the portion of the game where you're making decisions, and those decisions are who to trust, who to take out of the game because I trust them the least. That's some like the richest decision space theming that I think I've ever encountered in games.
Slam dunk. I agree. A lot of social deduction games fit here. Also, you also had Werewolf Down, which is of course true. Mafia, things like this. But I think that one thing that's so interesting is now that we're applying this lens, it's forcing me to think like, okay, what does a social deduction game with high environmental theming look like? And I want to play that game, right? So in my mind, it's like, okay, we're gonna have all of these objects that are small, so they're like punch out cardboard something that become important to the way in which the game plays out, and we're like interacting with each other, and us possessing this object becomes our hidden information, right? So like if I can present to you, Jake, this like special letter that has some implications in the game and I'm physically showing that to you, I think that could be an example of a high environmental themed social deduction game that sounds really cool to me that I can't think of an example for that exists.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, game designers, maybe this can be a useful tool to kind of come up with some creative stuff that might not be out there, or to understand why other games have made such a big mark and
Mm.
resonated with people. I haven't actually played it, but Blood on the Clock Tower, when it came out, was this like huge, huge thing. And I wonder if that was, again, I haven't played it, so maybe this isn't the case, but just from what I've heard about it, perhaps that's the case of a social deduction game that upped the mechanical theming by like adding all these different roles and the ways they interact with each other to kind of take this, tried and true thematic decision space, but like, up the mechanical theme.
Interesting. That leaves us with the lowest of the low environmental theme, the low mechanical theme, and the low decisional theming, where you just don't feel like you're doing what the subject of the game is at all. And one of the games that Jake and I have as an example is it made both of Jake and I's top tens. And I think that, if anything, should speak to what we've been saying, that these are not value judgments. And that game is Castles of Burgundy. What the heck? What even? Okay, the Castles of Burgundy, is that the setting? It doesn't even like seem like the setting. Why is it called the Castles of Burgundy? Why is it not like the Kingdoms of Burgundy? Because half of my board, only 4 small squares are castles. First of all, most of my gameplay is farming, bringing these animals together, shipping goods or building buildings. So what's going on there? And then do I feel like I'm running a castle in Burgundy? No, it has nothing to do with that.
Yeah, absolutely, 100% agree. This is a low, low, low game. And one thing I think of, just hearing you talk about it made me think of Quinn's from Shut Up and Sit Down did a review of Castle of Burgundy that I saw ages ago. That kind of came down to, it's like, what is this game come down to? It's like, well, did you fill up your Burgundy? If yes, great. If no, well, shit. And
Yeah.
that's the game, 100%. And what is that? Who the heck knows? But it's a ton of fun to play. The decisions are rich and great. They're just not thematic
Yeah.
in really any way.
A lot of abstract games, like, no, I guess not even, yeah, a lot of abstract games probably fall into this category. Checkers we had down. I would also say games that aren't necessarily games that a lot of people who listen to this podcast would be excited to play could fall into this. Like bingo is probably a low, low, low. There's not a lot of mechanical integration there, and you don't really feel like, I don't know, and it's just a word. in a way that something like The Mind, which is a game that has an evocative name like bingo does, you actually do feel some amount of that subject of the word of the mind within how it plays out mechanically in the game.
Okay, I'm so glad you brought up The Mind, because that was the other limited communication example that I wanted to bring up, where I think against all odds, like The Mind is actually has a really strong
Mechanical.
decisional theming. To me, like I really, it's so silly because it's this like game about being like psychic with your friends. And man, like that really feels like when I'm playing this game, like I'm being psychic with my friends. Like if I flip my card just before somebody else does and they were one card away from each other and we got it right, it's just like it's like a magic. I always describe this game as like it's more of a magic trick than a game, but
Yep.
it works so well, and I think it really does create this rich decisional theme, like everything from and it's the simple touches, it's the lack of communication, but it's also the fact that everybody has to put their palms down on the table before the round to like psychically connect, and it's the simple touches that just bring out the magic in that game.
I think that's another great example of a low high high, like BattleCon, like you mentioned, fighting games, because the environmental theming, like it's sort of why the only environmental theming of that game is the title. And then beyond that, you have like rabbits and shurikens, and none of it helps you play the game. It's just like more baggage to explain. But the mechanics of not talking, using your mind, and the decisional theming, I agree completely. There, great example of low high high. We gotta. I'm gonna add it to the notes, but can we just talk about one more game? And it wouldn't be a Decision Space podcast if we didn't. And that game is El Grande. You've put this in the disagreement category. Tell me why.
Well, you had it originally listed as medium, low, medium. And then I went through the notes and I decided, nope, we're just only doing binary. It makes more sense. We can't have mediums in here. And if I had to choose, I think it's going to be a low, low, low for
Low.
me. And I think that honestly, like just like Castles of Burgundy, sort of a lot of these
Classic dry Euros.
classic dry Euros are going to be low, low, low games for me. Just because, the environment, yeah, sure. There is, yes, we're in Spain. Okay.
Okay, here's where I was coming from. I think El Grande is aspirationally trying to be a high environmental theme with its use of the Castillo and the Grande token. And I think also just the presentation with the map, decisionally, I don't totally know what I am in that game. I think I'm like like Doge, or like, no, that's Italy, like a knight of some kind trying to like build some sort of influence in these different regions around the king,
Pooping your
the
cubes
Grande.
all over the board.
Yeah.
Like,
I feel I'm a lord trying to like have more control than other lords of these spaces. I think I do have some double think with the simultaneous card play, or the way in which the numbers come out. But yeah, you're right. It's pretty low overall. But I think it's an interesting case study in looking at what the game is trying to do and maybe what it accomplished and why it succeeds in general, which is that the decisions themselves are just excellent.
and honestly, that might be just, we talked about how fresh and new that game feels when we covered it from our normal perspective of decision space, but it actually might be in its environmental theming where it is actually showing its age.
Yeah.
If that came out today and the board just looked a little bit, nicer, if it had some great Ian O'Toole art, and maybe the Castillo was a plastic miniature and the El Grande looked like a person, then I'd feel like it actually does have high environmental theme.
And your cubes were little settlements or castles or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But because of, it's blocks of wood and a beige board with like no detail at all besides an outline of Spain.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, perhaps that's really speaking more to the game as a period in time, and how, our expectations for theme is shifting with Kickstarter and, all these incredible productions that we have in gaming today.
Yeah, I think that's very on the nose, Jake. So as we close out this podcast, I think for my closing thoughts, I just want to say that I hope that this lens of the three different types of ways that games basically convey their theme through environmental theming, mechanical theming, and decisional theming, equips you with a new tool to look at and think about games. Jake, what are your closing thoughts as you sort of reflect on our new lens here?
Yeah, thanks for this conversation, Brendan. I think it was a really great one. My closing thoughts are really just a bunch of questions for our audience because I think this is the start of a really interesting conversation. But I want to know if people can come up with their own examples for these categories. Can you complete the challenge and fill out our whole entire list here with games that we didn't mention? Um, but I also want to know, do you find when you look at your top 10 list that wow, actually, it turns out a lot of my favorite games fit into one of these categories. Could this be a useful tool to you moving forward, perhaps to think about whether it's a game you might enjoy or not, or maybe it's a way to think about like, hey, I actually have a gap in my collection. I don't have any of these type of games. I should check one out next time I'm at a board game cafe or something like that. So yeah, I mean, really just excited to hear what people have to say. Do you agree with us about the categories? And just can't wait to hear your thoughts.
Awesome. Well, with that, I would like to remind everyone that you can connect with Decision Space on Twitter at Decision Spa. You can find me, Brendan Hansen, there at Burnside BH, and you can find Jake at Jake FRYD. And you can also interact with the show on Board Game Geek. We have a blog there where we post new episodes every week. Comment and let us know how you feel. If you don't want to come into the Discord for more in-depth conversation, you can find the link to the Discord in the show notes. And as always, thank you to Hembry for their song Reach Out for our introduction and outro.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good week.